A workgroup is a logical grouping of Windows-based computers. It can include both Windows 10 and Windows Server devices. A device can belong to a single workgroup. A device cannot belong to a workgroup and an Active Directory Domain Services domain. Workgroups exist on a single network segment, that is, within the boundary of a collection of routers. Data can be shared in a similar way to home groups, that's on a distributed basis. To add a computer to a workgroup, open up the System Properties from Control Panel and then click Change Settings under the Computer Name, Domain and Workgroup Settings heading. In the Computer Name Domain Changes dialog box, click under the Member Of heading, click the Workgroup button and then enter the name of the workgroup and click OK. The first time a user tries to access a shared resource, they are prompted for a username and a password. It's important to note that the user account that they're prompted for resides on the sharing computer. So if I want to use a resource on your computer in a workgroup, you must provide me with the username and password. Given that I've signed in on my own computer with the username and password, there's no guarantee that the username I'm signed in with will match the username and password on your computer. This results in the prompt. The user can ask Windows to remember the password once they've entered it. The local security authority looks to the SAM database to see whether the account that was entered is valid. If the account is valid, the user is granted access. If the same user attempts to access another resource on the same computer, the user does not have to provide additional credentials. But if the same user attempts to access another resource on another computer, the user must repeat the process of providing credentials. So there's no centralization of user account management within a workgroup. A domain is a logical grouping of Windows-based computers. An Active Directory Domain Services domain is described as a logical administrative boundary. The domain contains a group called domain admins, members of which can perform management on any object in the domain, but not on any objects outside of the domain. Within a domain, you can group computers and users by creating organizational units. Domains are combined to create Active Directory Domain Service trees, which in turn combine to create forests. A domain can include both Windows 10 computers and Windows Server devices. A device can belong to a single ADDS domain, and a device cannot belong to a workgroup and a domain. Domains can exist on multiple IP network segments. When sharing resources, you can share data with much more control over who has access. To add a computer to a domain, once again open up the System Properties dialog and then access the Change Settings link, and then within the Computer Name Domain Changes dialog box, under the Member Of heading, click Domain and type the domain name. You'll be prompted for a username and password which has the appropriate permissions to join the computer to the domain. Typically that might be a domain administrator. If that's successful, you'll receive the Welcome to the Domain notification. You can now see that the fully qualified domain name of the computer has a pearson.com suffix. This computer now belongs to the domain. So in the demonstration, I'll show you how to add a computer to a domain, to share resources to users in the domain, and then to add the computer back to a workgroup, or put it another way, to remove the computer from a domain. To add a computer to a domain, I usually right-click this PC from File Explorer and choose Properties, and then click Advanced System Settings and click the Computer Name tab. You can see that the computer name CL1 is part of the workgroup. I'm going to change that now and specify a domain name. Now it's important that the computer you're adding to the domain can resolve the DNS name of the domain and locate a domain controller. It can only do that if you configure the client DNS settings correctly. You'll be prompted for an account that has the privilege to add a computer to a domain. I'm going to use the administrator account on the domain. And now I need to restart the computer. So after the restart, I can select Other User and then specify a user account in the Pearson domain. Administrator. and then sign in. It says uses the user's desktop. Meantime, over on the domain controller, we can take a look in Active Directory users and computers, and we can see under the computers node the computer for CL1. So that computer has been added to the domain as part of the process. Back over on the client computer CL1, you can share resources. Let's create a data folder, for example. Sharing, and say that I'd like to share it. And then on the security tab, I can specify who has permissions to that. Click Edit, click Add, and now, as you see here, it's going to scan from this location. So I can type in users like domain users, and you see that there is a group in the Pearson domain called domain users to which I can assign permissions. So it's very straightforward, and in fact the default when I'm signed in using an administrative account on an administrative machine or on a domain machine, I can easily select the users and groups to assign permissions to. So now anybody that's a member of the domain users group in the Pearson.com domain can access this shared folder. And to remove a computer from a domain, simply a question of reversing the process we looked at earlier. So we go to Advanced System Settings. On the Computer Name tab, we say Change. We click Workgroup, and we type the name of a workgroup. And once again, we'll need to restart the computers to have that change effective. Okay, so in the demonstration, you saw how to add a computer to a domain, how to share resources on that computer to users in the domain, and then how to disjoin the computer from the domain and add it back to a workgroup. Azure Active Directory is a cloud-based service. It provides identity management and access control capabilities for other cloud-based applications, such as Microsoft Office 365. It's stored in the Azure AD database, instead of on an on-premises ADDS database. With Azure AD, you can integrate with on-premise ADDS deployments through synchronization. When to use Azure AD? Well, some scenarios are access control for applications, integration with on-premise ADDS, single sign-on for cloud-based applications. So use Azure AD if most applications and resources that you use are in the cloud. You want to separate temporary accounts from regular standard accounts. You want to provide users with the ability to join their own device to the corporate environment. There are differences between Active Directory domain services in an on-premise environment and Azure AD in the cloud, and it's important to understand these. With ADDS, devices are joined to a domain and must run a supported operating system version. Devices in an ADDS domain are mostly managed using group policy or Microsoft System Center applications. Devices capable of joining an ADDS domain usually access on-premise applications and services. With Azure AD, the scope of devices that are capable of joining Azure AD is a bit wider, so they don't have to be specific types. When you join a device to Azure AD, you make it fully capable of accessing cloud-based resources and Azure-based resources by using single sign-on. But you can't manage these devices using group policy, but you can use Microsoft Intune to manage and provision these devices. So in this demonstration, I'll show you how to configure Azure AD Join. So before you can add a computer to Azure AD, the user requires a user ID in Azure AD. So navigate through a web browser to the portal.azure.com website and sign in as your Azure AD administrator, and then select Azure Active Directory from the navigation pane. Click Users, and then under All Users click New User. Type in the user's name and then the full username, which must include the Azure AD suffix. specify any groups that you want the user to belong to, or the role that the user has. You might want to add the user as a member of an administrative unit, make them a global administrator or a limited administrator, and then enter a password. Now you can see here it's set a default password. We can reconfigure that later, but for now we need to make a note of that. Then click Create. And there we have a new user account. So I'm going to reset that password by signing in. I'll open up a new in private window. And I will navigate to portal.azure.com. I will sign in as the new user. I'll enter the password that I was assigned. I'll re-enter that and then enter a new password and then sign in. I don't need to do a tour and I don't need to stay signed in. I'm going to sign out and close that browser window. So that enables me to reset my password. So I now need to configure device settings. Back to Azure Active Directory, devices and device settings. So users may join devices to Azure AD. At the moment that's configured to all. I'm going to say selected, and then I'm going to select who has that privilege. I'm going to say that Andrew can do that. And then click OK. I can require multi-factor authentication to join, and I can limit the number of devices per user. I'm not going to do any of that. I'm just going to allow Andrew to add computers and click Save to that. So now the next thing to do is to configure the system properties. So if I click Start, choose Settings, and then click System, click About, and then choose Connect to Work or School. Click Connect. Choose Join this device to Azure Active Directory. Specify the account name to do that. That's my account. The password. Then click Join. And then click Done. So now if I go back to the portal and Azure Active Directory, choose Devices, you can see there's the device CL1. It's Azure AD joined. It's running Windows 10. The username is andrew@pearson697698.onmicrosoft.com. It's all as it should be. So in the demonstration I showed you how to configure Azure AD join.